I'm here with Eric Minton. Eric is a Baptist minister, therapist, a coach, an author, a husband, a father, and I'm really excited to have this time to chat with him because he recently published this book, which I have found to be extraordinarily helpful. I have so many questions that I want to ask him. Eric, thanks for making time to chat with me.
Thanks, Mark. I'm excited to do it.
Awesome. Your book is entitled, It's Not You, It's Everything. An awesome title. What happened in your life, in your work, that prompted you to say, I need to write this book?
Well, first things first, Mark, I'm legally obligated by the bounds of marriage to tell everyone that my wife came up with the title of the book. At a certain point, my publisher did not like my original title ideas. And then for about 3 to 4 months, I'd have these email chains with one of my managing editors about where I just sent like 10 titles of mostly the same constellation of words, and all of them were no's. And so then finally my wife was like, what do you call it this thing? And then I sent her one idea to these people, and they're like, oh, that's gold. It's genius. So it's my wife's idea.
Kudos to her.
Yeah, right. Lindsay's a genius. She's much better as a therapist and in so many ways, the title of the book. But for me, again, the question is, I got an email from the publishing house in February of 2020. So right before the world kind of ended there. And it was like, hey, do you have content for a book? We've read some of your stuff online, and I've written in various outlets before. And they were like, oh, I'm wondering if you like put together a proposal for us. So from that standpoint, it was a blind email from a couple of managing editors at the publishing house that published my book. And it was a weird time to think about doing that. And I had for many years thought about writing a book, and had toyed with the idea of the intersection of some of the streams of thought that I had worked in before, Mark. So I was a pastor for many years and went to seminary, and then transitioned out of that and became a psychotherapist. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in the state of Tennessee, and so is my wife, and we share a practice together. And so I saw the work that she was doing before I was doing that work myself, and I thought this seems more interesting than the work that I was doing as a pastor. So I had a son, and then a month later I went back to graduate school again, which is a recommendation I don't give to anyone now.
That is a tall task for sure.
Yeah, it's not ideal. So and then at that point, so those two things were interesting to me. And then I was at the point of getting this email and being asked to write this book, or at least propose one. I was working in a high needs, I'm trying to remember the exact word, maybe like a Title I, that's it, a federal grant funded school, high school in Knoxville, where I'm from. And it's underfunded and has a lot of students with socio-emotional needs or behavioral dysregulation issues. And so I was spending a lot of time with them. And so there was this undercurrent of my word, like understanding the way that educational and infrastructure and economic disparities drive a lot of the ways that we're taught to talk about student behavior or student outcomes or adolescent behavior, or adolescent outcomes. And then having some great mentors along the way that helped me kind of understand, like, oh, well, actually our kind of economic structure as a whole dictates a lot of the ways that we've thought to deal with technology or education or healthcare. And so then it just made sense in my mind, at least, maybe not to the readers, to put all of those things together. And so to talk about things from a standpoint of like, what if we discuss what it means to be a human right now amidst a world that may or may not be ending periodically, what it means to kind of try to be a human underneath these kind of pressures of capitalism and just this environment of bottomless competition and productivity and scarcity. Also understanding that like the ways that religion and especially American Christianity, or the stream I kind of come out of, American evangelical Christianity, kind of sit or press upon that in contrast, even with the way that healthcare or mental health care in America kind of functions as well. So the book itself is sort of trying to ask some key questions, not only about, how do we survive? How do we manage things in the midst of these competing influences? But also, how do we do more than that? Sometimes, how are we okay, despite the fact that, again, economically, religiously, sometimes even interpersonally, the invitation is to be bottomlessly anxious all of the time. So that was the impetus of the book. It's a little bit about my own life in the midst of that, becoming a pastor and a therapist and a human. But then it's also asking these larger questions about what it means to be an American person right now who probably isn't okay.
One of the ways that you dive into all of this is through the theme of pain, identifying pain and why we need to listen to pain, pay attention to it. Why do you think that's an important thing?
Most of the time because we're asked not to. Even when and as a therapist, people come to my office regularly and they called me to see a therapist. And usually it's not because there's the couch right there. And usually it's not because they're doing awesomely. And it's amazing how quickly and how hard I have to work to get people to articulate what's bothering them. And sometimes it takes hours or bottomless appointments occasionally to get people to just become comfortable saying, yeah, this is hard for me, or this part is difficult, or this thing that happened to me has created all this sort of resonance in my life that I'm uncomfortable with. Because for the early parts of the appointment, it's like, oh yeah, but it's fine. It's fine. And it clearly wasn't. You called me. This is a therapist's office. It's happening to you right now. But there are so many and so as I was having that experience more and more with people, or when you interact with people in public and they ask you how you're doing, the answer is not terribly. It's, oh, I'm fine. I'm doing fine. And it's been amazing to be able to interact with, even in my practice, with people who are not Americans, and having them come over here and talk about the struggles and being asked, how are you at work or in their personal lives? And they say, oh, in my home country, we tell people the truth when they ask us this question. And then I learned in America that no one does that. And if you do tell people the truth, if you're having complicated feelings about your life, they very quickly ask you to talk to a professional about that, or they leave the conversation altogether. And so for us, does that make sense, Mark?
Oh, absolutely. That resonates completely. There's something about being an American in this capitalist society that's hyper competitive, where we compare ourselves to each other all the time, that kind of gives way to that. But then doesn't it seem there's something also about the Christian subculture that compels us to want to put forward this image that I'm fine, I'm doing well, might even want to say I'm blessed, even though we're really struggling and we're experiencing intense pain that's impacting the way we go about life, impacting our relationships.
Well, yeah, and I think that in the book, and I have a good friend of mine who's also a psychologist in Nashville. He taught at Vanderbilt Divinity School for a long time. His name's Bruce Rogers Vaughn. And he introduced me to the concept of humans being brands. And I thought, oh, interesting, Bruce, this is fascinating. And then the book starts with a conversation I got to have with a student I didn't see for therapy, but one that was at the high school where I was working, and them getting in a physical altercation with another student because that student had stolen this first student's brand and had started posting like them on the internet. And so Bruce talked to me about, in larger capitalist societies, people, the way that we understand ourselves as holding or maintaining value is by increasing our productivity and essentially turning ourselves into like micro companies all of the time. And so if we brand ineffectively, and he's like, social media really exacerbates this by taking these hyper realized or perfectly staged photographs or epigraphs or whatever we're putting out there on the internet as like some sort of version of us. But really, if you watch people and it's remarkable, when like tragedy befalls us, Mark, as a society, how quickly people become public relations departments on the internet. And they feel like they need to like change their profile picture or make some sort of statement like they're the UN when a wildfire happens to California, or like, I think Tom Petty's still alive, but let's say he died. They need to have some sort of memorial like they're the local news. And so for me, this is fascinating. And so it's asking ourselves like, okay, like there is this cultural expectation that we are constantly branding and that we're presenting ourselves as a way that's going to increase our success and our stability in a hyper competitive society where people are constantly trying to, best one another, like you said. And so
I
then
totally see that.
And then you add that like theological element to it though, Mark, of saying like, also at least for me, I was raised in a subculture where as an evangelical Christian, we're taught to brand for Jesus all the time, where even if we talk about our pain, it's to be able to pivot to, but isn't he good? Like, doesn't he maintain his love for us? Like, isn't he faithful despite all of this? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I also, just because of the circles in which I run around, I think pastors feel compelled to have their brand, and clergy are feeling compelled to put themselves out there and to comment on certain things, present a certain image, want to put forward this notion, see how well I'm doing, see how successful my ministry is. And because that ministry is successful, therefore I'm successful
Mm,
slash faithful. And
mm.
so everything that you wrote in the book about branding, I especially saw a connection to the way that I think many clergy people feel compelled to put themselves out there.
Well, as a Methodist, this will be near and dear to your heart, but Duke Divinity, and I quote the study in the book, but they put out a study where they asked clergy folk in the UMC just basic health questions, but most of them were about their mental well-being.
I participated in
Yeah,
that study. I know exactly the
this
one you're
is
talking about.
this is amazing. I'm glad I'm meeting one of you in person. And so yeah, and I'm sure you're definitely aware of it. But to just kind of quickly talk about it, the study asked people to correspond via the internet, like so anonymous surveys that they're filling out versus phone interviews where they're asking people with another person's voice, "How are you doing?" And all the people that are asked, of course, are like you, Mark, they're clergy folk. And so they were talking about even the disparity and honesty between the survey responses that you got from the internet, like box ticking, where people don't know who you are, and the authenticity and responses from people calling on the phone. And that they would say that, when we look at the survey numbers, we would say 10% or 12%. I can't remember what the numbers are now. Or maybe let's say even 15% of clergy responses were clearly not doing very well in terms of their mental well-being. But then when we interviewed people on the phone, the number was closer to 5%. And so even in the nature of the study itself that's trying to understand how well are our clergy doing, they're saying we have to be careful about how we ask the question because the branding is so extreme.
I
Does that
get
make
it.
sense?
I
Yeah,
get
yeah.
it. One of the other themes you talk about in the book, you've got this great phrase, radically okay,
Mhm.
that people need to embrace that, understand what that means to be radically okay. Talk more about that.
Yeah. Like sometimes I think for us, and I wanted to be clear about this, is that occasionally folks can get the idea that like I'm okay, like it's okay, like you're okay, I'm okay. But really, what that word ends up doing a lot of, at least in my professional life, is silencing people when they're not themselves, or when they have complicated experiences, or when they go home for Thanksgiving and they have a difference of opinion with all of their extended family. And so they have to just be okay with everything, even though they're probably not, and there's great reason for that. And so for us, at least in the book that I'm trying to articulate here, and that what we try to do it in our practice, is help people understand that the pain that they are experiencing is valid and it's there for a reason. And oftentimes, especially if it's presenting as depression and anxiety, it's trying to be adaptively helpful to us. It's trying to get our attention and let us know that the experience that we're having as people on earth is inhumane and not survivable at the moment, and our body recognizes that. And so for us, what we would say is that we don't need to be okay with the pain or the context that creates that kind of experience for people. What we want to do is help people provide stability for themselves amidst contexts that are inhumane, not by telling themselves, I can just get better at managing this inhumane context by working more and emailing more and branding more and like performing more. It's by saying, no, I'd like to be radically okay with myself because I am cared for and loved by a God who is uninterested in my bottomless productivity, and not the God of the evangelical or even mainline subcultures that many of us grew up in, that is primarily concerned with this God's image and how this God is presenting to the world and how many people worship and care for this God, and that our lives are about propping up the fickle ego of this divine parent that we have. That radical okayness, at least is how I'm trying to present it, Mark, is more about this idea of saying, no, I'm loved independent of the kind of branding or productivity I bring to the world, because there is a God who is profoundly uninterested in such things and who loves me independent of some sort of superstructure of what I provide for this God's stability or well-being. So I liken it to the kind of parent who doesn't need you to be good at baseball because it makes that parent feel good about things they missed out on in their own childhood. And so it's interesting that a lot of our theological tradition is about making God feel more like God. that God's like powerful and strong and big and feels really important when we go worship him and sing the right songs and do all these sorts of things. Whereas if a kid comes into my office and says, yeah, most of my life is about making my dad feel more like my dad, we routinely call that parentification. Or we see kids who have depression and anxiety and who are internalizing a lot of work that frankly is not theirs to do. But then in the church tradition, we tell people that's very much what it means to be an Orthodox Christian. And so in that kind of culture, we want people to find ways to become themselves and to become okay by first acknowledging the pain that they're experiencing, knowing what that pain is inviting them to do, perhaps become more productive or destructive or chaotic, and to instead experience this kind of profound love and trustworthiness from a God who is uninterested in them being anything but themselves.
The way that we connect with each other, the way we connect with our parents, is so illustrative about our understanding of connecting with God. And that concept of parentification, you mentioned it here, you wrote about it in the book. I feel like this is a very deep well from which we need to continue to find resource and understanding. And I feel like many of us are just beginning to identify this in order to really understand who we are and our approach to understanding who God is. And I think a lot of it begins with how did we connect with our parents and our family of origin? Growing up, I always wanted a treehouse. I wanted a treehouse so badly, but where we lived, there was no tree that was really suitable for a treehouse. But I was always convinced, no, we could fit one up in there. So when we moved to where we currently live, which was back in 2014, task number one, we're going to build a treehouse for my kids. And I was convinced that it was the right thing to do, not because we had a tree that was suitable for it, not because my kids were really, really wanting one. I wanted one.
Yeah.
And it was really all about feeling the need to become the dad that I thought I needed to be based on what I wanted from my childhood.
Yeah.
So we've got a really cool treehouse out there. I think the kids have climbed into it a dozen times over the years.
That feels right. This is, Mark, this is most of my work with myself, as much as it is the work with people I spend time with in my office. Is I have a 7.5-year-old who is bottomlessly interesting. And so I realized he was doing this thing when he was probably old enough to talk, but not much, maybe like 1.5 or 2 years old. And he would fall down, and sometimes he still does it, but he would fall down, and you'd hear him running. We have hardwood floors in our house, and it's ancient, and so you'd hear him running, and then you'd hear like this huge boom, and then the first thing out of his mouth is, "I'm okay." And then later, maybe like 30 minutes or an hour later, he'd come over to us and he'd be crying, and it was clear that he was bleeding or had some other problem happening. And then it would be, "Hey, why did you tell me you were okay earlier when clearly like you're having a medical problem here that I would have loved to have known about before this point, and you bled on the rug?" And it was, and he obviously being 2, 3 years old can only say, "I don't know." And so then I'm talking to my wife, who again titled my book and is clearly a much better therapist than I am, looks over at me and says, "Well, Eric," and so I'm asking her about this. "Why is he doing this?" And before I Google it and Google tells me he's going to die, my wife has this comment where she says, "Well, Eric, maybe it has something to do with the like 35-year-old man who keeps following him up every playset, asking him if he's okay all the time." I'm like, "Oh, interesting. You're probably right." So, like I was doing this thing where I grew up in a different kind of way than my son. And I'm trying to kind of counteractively sort of have this experience for him that is very much about, "Hey, I'm here. I'm present for you. I care about what's happening to you. I want you to know that I care about your well-being." And it's weird, Mark. I was actually underneath the current of that, passively communicating. "Actually, I need you to be okay, because otherwise I'm not going to be okay if you aren't." And so I was putting all this reflexive pressure on my son to be okay for me, even when he's not. And so now I feel like I've been working for the past 3 or 4 years to help him unlearn that, because again, of my own baggage as a kid growing up in my family. So it's not a tree house, but I think all of us have this kind of struggle.
Sure. I think you're right. And you do a great job in the book of helping us to peel away the layers of, culture, capitalism, religion that, impact the way that we kind of bring all this together. And I think part of the challenge is when we start to understand a goal about who we need to become. I think there's something about being an American Christian that says, okay, what are the next 3 steps I need to do about it? And becoming radically okay is not a complete steps 1, 2, and 3, but it's about not doing things. It's about unplugging. It's about relenting. It's not giving up, but it's about stopping. And so I think that there's a Sabbath logic in a lot of what you're talking about with being radically okay.
Yeah. Heschel, Abraham Heschel, of course, for those of you who didn't waste their time in seminary, he wrote this a little monograph about the Sabbath. That's probably, gosh, I don't know, 7,500 pages.
Yeah, it's a classic.
Yeah. Oh my word. And it's like Rumi, but for morons like myself. He just does such a great job of articulating so many things about his own inherent kind of mystical Jewish tradition that I think really encapsulate this kind of not just Sabbath from a standpoint of resting, but Sabbath as an act of resistance to this productivity culture that we're sort of bathed in all the time. And he's writing it in the 60s, and so it's amazing. And so that for me was really formative, even in seminary and in my first pastoral call, was having this experience with Heschel and then feeling this kind of inverse thing from my church culture and the culture at large of saying, like, actually, I should be really good at practicing the Sabbath. And so it's amazing how quickly that sort of capitalist impulse gets underneath the skin of all of us, where it's, I need to be self-caring myself into oblivion. I need to be joining the self-care industrial complex by seeing a therapist. Everybody, you should go to therapy. There are teenagers that tell me they're just TikToks now where you get diagnosed with mental health disorders based on whatever they tell you. Is like, oh, if you go to a party and you put your hand in a bowl of bugles, you probably have bipolar disorder. It's not that. But, there's just, again, like the internet is like it's just got this kind of constant feed of, yeah, like let's take something that's probably meaningful and deeply important for us as humans, and let's turn it into a business or an industry or a brand. And so Sabbathing can be that very same thing. And so for me, like when I was writing through this book, and I remember talking to several editors and the publisher, and them saying like, yeah, Eric, there's not a thing at the end that tells us, okay, good, this is how we fix this problem. And I think I kept telling them, yeah, because I'm one person. I'm a 37-year-old man in East Tennessee who has a dog and a son, and I'm trying to help people. But like, I don't have the problems to late stage. I don't have the answers to late stage capitalism. I don't have the answers to why the evangelical subculture has so thoroughly wrecked our democracy and our experience of being humans together in the world. I don't have an answer for these like larger scale issues. What I'd like, and I'd also like other people to stop feeling that pressure themselves. And so when pastors tell me I need to have a response to every problem that besieges the world, I would say, yeah, please don't. Because what is happening in this context, Mark, is that society itself parentifies us. When institutions, when political agencies, when democracy itself, when our healthcare industry refuses to care for us in ways that it says it's going to and in ways that we deserve to as people, when our education system does this, it then puts pressure on individuals to solve the problem. So teachers, students, pastors, therapists, doctors, anyone is then said like, oh, I'm in a society that doesn't care for me and is unsafe. And it's up to me individually as an individual person to solve the weight of these problems. So I need to be really good at math, and I need to be really effective. I need to be really capable. I need to be really strong. I need to be all of these things, because if I'm not, bad things will happen to me. And so for us, I would say in that kind of infrastructure, Sabbath isn't just one more practice that you can maximize your potential and be more successful in a system that refuses to care for you. Sabbath is an act of resistance to that kind of pressure, because it's not your job. And so for me, like, it's like doing nothing is absolutely doing something. It's this idea of saying I'm taking an active step to stop trying to bear the weight of responsibility that isn't mine to bear. And stop trying to make God feel more like God. Stop trying to make democracy feel more like democracy. Stop trying to make society be kinder with every Facebook post I can put out there. It's by saying, like, no, look, what if I stop taking responsibility for a situation that refuses to care for its citizens by just caring for myself first? And then when we take a break from that, I like to believe that then we're able to, and Dan Siegel, who's a neuroscientist at UCLA, he talks about it, that when our brain becomes back re-intact or reintegrated, he calls it the whole brain approach, and he works with kids a lot. And so he would say, you know, when we are emotionally dysregulated, our amygdala becomes overactive in stress and then turns on that fight or flight response we all talk about a lot. And so he said, it's like likens it to the top part of our brain. If you can't see me, the top, I've got my open hand on top of my fist. And so when we're ourselves, we can mostly make our brain do what we want it to do because our higher level rational thought is engaged in our prefrontal cortex. But then when we encounter stress, our amygdala overactivates and turns off this part of our brain because it's unhelpful for surviving a bear attack. We don't need to be doing long division when we're trying to survive. And so we're just pure reaction at this point. Our society keeps us in this kind of state all of the time. It makes us easier to sell products to. It makes us easier to use the internet more. Negative engagement on Facebook and Twitter keeps people connected to Facebook and Twitter. So you're going to see more of that. So society is primed, because it's a capitalist industry that wants to sell you things, to make you emotionally dysregulated all of the time. And so when we're becoming radically okay, it's not by ignoring that. It's by taking care of ourselves first and re-engaging our brain by saying, I'm not responsible for the plight of the world, but I am responsible for what I do right now. And so when we slow down and we take care of ourselves, then we actually reconnect the part of our brain that's helpful for creative problem solving, for collaborative possibility, for connection with other people, for societal change, because we've banded together with other church members or community members or colleagues or friends or neighbors, and we're actually able to have productive conversation because we have our whole brains attached and not just the part that's trying to brand because it's afraid we're going to drown. And so that's the idea of this kind of Sabbath radical okayness and this kind of pressure, is that I'm actually trying to help people become more productive in solving some of these problems, but not by taking responsibility for them, if that makes any sense at all.
Incredibly insightful, everything you're saying here. It brings up so many thoughts. I did some reading years ago. Hans Sallier, the researcher who did a lot on the stress response back decades ago, one of his big insights was, yes, sometimes we need to adapt to a stressor, OR is the ending, but sometimes we need to just remove the stressor. And so we can't adapt to it. It's too debilitating, too harmful. The simple example is a splinter. You just got to remove the splinter. Otherwise, you're going to just keep having pain. And so I think some of the things we need to figure out is, what stressors do we need to remove? That is, stop checking social media. Stop being addicted to doom scrolling on your phone. Stop reading these news stories. Stop, right? I mean, there needs to be a lot of stopping out there in the world.
Yeah. Well, and you know, easier said than done.
Yeah.
Right. Like, because for me, I can see my phone right now. I'm not looking at it, but I can see it. And, you know, like one of these things when we're talking about how we've, again, almost had our brains rewired anyway, Mark, that when there have been all these fascinating studies about the outcomes of standardized testing when people have their phones on the desk, when students have their phones in their bags on the floor, or when students have their phones even out of the room and in a locker.
Wow.
On the other side. And we see score increases, or excuse me, we see score decreases as the student gets closer to their phone, even if it's turned off and they know it. So it could be sitting on their desk turned off, and we know the quality of the conversation and the content of the conversation remains surface level. And we know the quality and content reproduction on a test is minimal compared to even if that phone is turned off and in a bag, or that phone is turned off in a locker outside of the room. And so that's the kind of pull we're talking about. Even when the thing is turned off, it's got that kind of gravitational black hole quality to it. So we're not saying like, yes, absolutely, you've got to stop these things, because it's like smoking cessation or reducing substance use, if that's been an issue for you in the past. And so it's a regular practice of okayness in the face of something that is constantly inviting you to be emotionally dysregulated, to be in this sort of like heightened arousal state all of the time. And it's inviting you to bear the weight of responsibility for fixing educational, societal, democratic failures in our country. And so bearing the weight of that all of the time is like being a middle schooler who feels in charge of their parents' divorce. It's exhausting. And so the thing that I want to tell people all the time, if you fail at it, that's fine. It's because you're not good at it in the first place, because it's not your job. So we're just practicing together.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, very,
Yeah.
very insightful. Hey, listen, before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I would love for you to share with everybody listening the story you share at the end of your book about pickle jar, fireflies. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, no. So there's a story at the end of the book where I grew up in East Tennessee, and if you're not from the South, or I'd say most folks are, there's this asphyxiating quality to the humidity that greets us. And so for me, one of the things that we would do in the summer when it would break was that we would catch lightning bugs, and that we would keep them in these jars that my mom would have. And so we'd catch them in pickle jars. And this is before I realized that, like, I'm just murdering these fireflies. But I would catch them, put them in the jar, poke holes in the top, and then I'd put them in my room, and I'd wake up the next morning, and obviously they'd be deceased. And so I realized for a long time that this was kind of an impulse of mine. I always found lightning bugs really compelling. And so my first job as a pastor out of seminary, some church members of mine, and it was in an area of East Tennessee that I was not from, but it was close to probably 45 minutes from where I grew up. And they told me, Eric, there is this experience in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which again, I grew up going to a lot as a kid, where there's this thing called the synchronous fireflies. And so they, every year, early June, it's mating season for these fireflies, and they have these coordinated flickering, and there's millions of them. And like there's this lottery system, and you have to apply for tickets a year in advance. And it's like trying to get Taylor Swift tickets, but worse. And there's nowhere to park, and it's this insane thing that people love doing. And I thought, you're full of it. I've never heard of this in my entire life. And they're like, are you serious? You're from East Tennessee, you've never heard of this? I was like, no, I just caught these things and killed them for most of my childhood. There are more of them. And so then it's amazing, Mark. Like they were like, well, we've got a campsite, and like bring like Lindsay, like that's my wife, and our son wasn't born at this point. And just come up, eat dinner with us, and then we'll walk over to where they do it. And you don't even have to have tickets. And I'm like, oh my word, yes, I want to do this. So we go up there, and we get in this place, and we have these camping chairs, and it gets to be like 11 o'clock at night in the summer because it's pretty light outside for a long time. And then they just start up, and it's just this remarkable kind of thing where you're seeing these huge trails of light, and there's this constant flickering, but they're interacting with each other, and it's like nothing I've ever seen. And I remember leaning over to a friend of mine who had invited me to come do this with them and saying, I had no idea this was 45 minutes from my house. And I was like, usually I just, again, like spent most of my childhood like catching 3 or 4 of them and pretending like this was the thing. And they were like, oh yeah, no, we've been coming every year. It's remarkable. And so then later, after having this experience, I think I talk about this in the book, I would like go to parties, or I would go to cookouts in the summer, or I'd be, at an event somewhere, and it'd be dark, and then you see these lightning bugs, and people would be like, oh, the lightning bugs are out. And immediately I would interrupt them and be like, yeah. But have you seen these guys play Elkmont? Because it's incredible. It's just remarkable. You should go up here. I was just this like bottomless evangel for this synchronous firefly experience in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And I remember talking to someone about this later, and describing that, like, yeah, like when someone introduced me to this idea of the crucifixion and the resurrection, that there's a God who, when push comes to shove and sacrifices are required, doesn't tie God's kids to the altar, but ties himself, and says to us, there's not a version of you that I won't always welcome. And then even after the crucifixion, and this God's closest followers lock themselves in the upper room for fear of the authorities that they're going to get crucified too. And they're all afraid, and they're all kind of like doubting and questioning and pretending like they never knew this guy. It says that the resurrected Jesus shows up even though the door was locked. And the first thing that this God says to them is, peace be with you. And so then again, one of them named Thomas is out getting like bread and milk in a crisis. And so then he comes back and he's like, you guys are full of it. There's no way that this happened to you. I'll have to just like physically touch this ghost in the scars to believe you. And then the resurrected Jesus shows up again. And the text even tells us, even though the door was locked again for a second time, and then says, peace be with you. And so for me, Mark, the experience on the other side of being a professional Christian who used to get paid to pray, was this realization that for a long time I had been trying to introduce people to a God in the same ways that I had been trying to introduce people to fireflies, as if they were like these dying lights inside of a pickle jar on top of the headboard of my waterbed. Or that there's this God that's like, oh yeah, but like you gotta like care for it, and you gotta love him, and you gotta like worship him, and you gotta work really hard to please him, and you gotta like maintain that relationship all the time. And gosh, if you don't, then bad things happen to you. And then to think that also there's this other version of this story where like 45 minutes from your house, there's like this flickering field of millions of these things that you just are invited to participate and enjoy all of the time. And you don't actually, they don't care if you tell people about them. They don't care if you keep them alive. They don't care if you even notice them at all, because they exist independent of you. And you're just invited to participate in it and to sit there with your friends and family and to bear witness to it. And so, like, you know, there's this thing that I keep coming back to that I'm like, oh man, like, what if Christianity could be like that? That like, there's like, again, we're pointing at this jar full of dead fireflies when in fact there's like a forest full of living ones all of the time available to us, 45 minutes from where we live. And so for me, man, like, I think that at the bottom of it is the thing that keeps me tethered to Christianity, even though I don't work for it anymore, is because maybe I don't have to. Maybe it's already doing the thing that it's supposed to do. And maybe its goal isn't to get me to perform for it. It's just to be loved by it. So that's the story.
I think that is a fantastic way to reimagine grace. It's there, just around the corner. It's beautiful. We don't have to make it happen. We can appreciate it, enjoy it, experience it with others. But ultimately, God's grace at work in the world is not dependent on us. And it's not up to us to capture it.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I've taken up enough of your time. I'm so thankful for you being available to chat with me. This has been a lot of fun. The book is entitled It's Not You, It's Everything. You could pick it up at bookstores, online. Eric Minton, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's been a gift. Appreciate the time.